Chapter 1, The Changing Family. At the beginning of each chapter, you will see the learning objectives, and we will find out and touch on each of these topics throughout the chapter. I'm not going to read all of these right now, but if you go through the original slide package, in this particular chapter, we're going to talk about the definition of the family, describe the family, how they're similar, how they're different, some myths, comparing the three perspectives on why families are changing, look at the micro level, macro level approaches, look at some demographics, multicultural, cross-cultural perspectives in understanding families. How we define the family has important political and economic consequences, determining its members' rights and obligations. Who, for example, gets Social Security benefits, who they go to, who gets health coverage, healthcare coverage, who gets an inheritance. And the meaning of the family differs from one group of people to another, and it may even change over time. So, it's important to understand what the definitions. We have some traditional definitions of the family, and we also have some contemporary or current definitions of the family. So, for example, some of the traditional definitions of the family include a unit of two or more people who are related by blood, marriage, or adoption. They live together, they form an economic unit, and they bear and raise children. Now, the U.S. Census Bureau, if everybody's hearing on the news and knowing that this is a decennial census year, and so the census is required by law. And they also have a definition of the family. And the U.S. Census defines the family as two or more people living together related by birth, marriage, or adoption. These definitions, though, have been challenged by social scientists because they fail to include a diverse group that also consider themselves family. For example, what about child-free couples or cohabitating couples, gay and lesbian couples with and without children, grandparents who are raising their children, foster families, elderly siblings who live together, men and women and their pets, their fur babies. So, we need to, as far as current definitions, social scientists believe there needs to be a more inclusive definition. Your author of your textbook defines the family as an intimate group of two or more people who live together in a committed relationship. They care for one another and any children, share activities and close emotional ties. Now, this definition is more inclusive, but notice it does not make mention of marriage, procreation, or child rearing. So definitions are becoming much more complex, but also controversial. So if we include reproductive technology, in vitro fertilization, surrogacy, and those sorts of examples. Definitions of family also may include what we refer to as fictive kin. And these are non-relatives who are accepted as a part of the family. They have strong bonds with the biological family members, providing services and care. And some of these relationships are stronger than those established by blood or marriage. So you'll see throughout this chapter, there's some questions. So what is a family? Is it people who live together in the same dwelling, people related by blood, marriage, or adoption, people that share activities and close emotional ties, or is it D, all of these? Give me a minute to think about it. The answer is D, all of these are correct. There are people who live together in the same dwelling, related by blood, marriage, or adoption, people that share activities and close emotional ties. Question 2, fictive kin are people who are related by blood, true or false? And that answer is false. That's correct. Single mothers are a variation of fictive kin, and many are unmarried, college-educated women. They just depend on each other for companionship and help with child care, so they don't necessarily have to be related by blood. Next, we're going to talk about how families are similar worldwide, how families function, marriage and some of its rules. The family is an institution that exists in all societies, and we call that in sociology a universal. It's universal and that exists in all society. And worldwide, they're similar in that they encourage marriage and trying to ensure children select the right, and right in air quotes, the right mate. Although families may vary in the U.S. and globally, they fulfill 5 important functions to ensure society's survival. This would be considered from the functionalist perspective, how families function. The first function is the regulation of sexual activity, and every society has norms or culturally defined rules for behavior about who may engage in sexual relations, with whom, and under what circumstances. In the U.S., we have laws against having sex with minors, yet some cultures do permit marriage with young girls. In fact, there was a New York Times article describing how common this is in some 50 countries. Marriage as young as, young girls as young as 8 years old. In our society, we would consider that, a detriment to young girls who would be too young and not, be afforded an education. So we need to think about that from those country perspectives. And we also have the incest taboo, which is a cultural norm that forbids sex between close relatives, brother and sister, father, daughter, uncle, niece, grandparent, grandchild. And we know that, through science and research that having close, intimate relations between relatives can increase the incidence of genetic diseases. And some examples where incest was practical is in the Incan Empire, Hawaii, ancient Persia, and the whole idea is that you keep the bloodline close to the family, and it is meant to minimize jealousy, keeping land within the family. So there was some functions to that. According to anthropologists, wealthy Egyptians practiced sibling marriage to keep land and property within the family, for example. Okay, so the second function is procreation and socialization. Now, procreation is essential in that it replaces personnel. Really unfancy word, to describe people, the country's population. And while some choose to remain child-free, others go to great lengths to conceive children. Socialization is a process we will spend more time talking about in this semester, is the process of acquiring language, accumulating knowledge, attitudes, beliefs, and values of the culture, and learning the social and interpersonal skills to function in society. We're socialized from birth throughout our lives. We are socialized through roles, the obligations and expectations that are attached to a particular status or position in society. So in our families, we learn the roles and relationships. Primary, the family is the primary agent of socialization. What those roles of a mother are, a father, siblings, parents and children, other relatives and non-family relatives. Some of the rights and responsibilities associated with our roles may not always be clear as family structure often changes or shifts. For example, during a family, there's a divorce or a step family, what are the new role expectations? And we need to learn, re-socialize. The third function is economic security. The family provides financial security and stability for its members. Families, for example, supply food and shelter and clothing and other material resources to ensure the family's physical survival. Especially during difficult times like the economic recession in 2007, families turned to kin for financial help in childcare and a place to live and job searches. Mothers with children under the age of 6 who were in the labor force increased from only 39% in 1975 to 64% in 2011. Leaving the traditional family where mom stays home to take care of kids as more of a luxury many families really cannot afford. The fourth function is emotional support. American sociologist Charles Horton Cooley introduced the concepts of a primary group, a small group of people who are characterized by close, long-lasting, intimate, and face-to-face interactions. The family is considered a primary group. It provides nurturance, love, emotional support for its members to be happy, healthy, and secure. Friends may also be members of our primary group, but some not always, long lasting throughout our life. Members of our secondary group, which is a temporary collection of people characterized by formal, impersonal, short-term relationships that work together to achieve a common goal. For example, your classmates, you're together for the duration of a semester, or your coworkers, you're there to meet the goal of what you're working towards. These are more have few emotional ties and generally leave once the goal is obtained. When you finish the semester, move on to a different job, those sorts of things. Now, the fifth function is social class placement. Social class is a group of people who have a similar standing or rank in society based on wealth, education, power, and prestige. Those in the same social class typically share similar attitudes and values. We inherit our social position based on that of our parents. Our social mobility up or down depends on factors such as motivation, hard work, and even opportunity. Our social class affects family life. Lower, working, middle, and upper classes, families, these types of families vary in when they marry, the number of children that they may have, their parenting styles and how they socialize the children, and in how partners and spouses relate to each other. Do they share housework, childcare, things like that. Marriage is another similarity. Marriage everywhere marks an important rite of passage. Marriage, like family, is a universal. It is a socially approved mating relationship that people expect to be stable and enduring. Countries vary in the norms and laws on who can marry whom, and at what age they can marry. It is an important rite of passage marking adulthood, including the responsibility of providing for a family. U.S. marriages are legally defined as ceremonial, or we have non-ceremonial marriage as well. Ceremonial are where a couple must follow procedures that are set forth by the state or some other jurisdiction, like buying the marriage license. You have to wait maybe a certain amount of time after applying for that license, being married by an authorized official. There's some basic requirements. Many couples go above and beyond with really elaborate ceremonies. There's some definite procedures that are required. So there's some basics, and then the elaborate marriage weddings, with the ice sculptures and those destination type weddings and things like that. Now, common law marriage is considered a non-ceremonial relationship between, that is established between people, who live together. Through their basic requirements that would be known to have that you're in a common law marriage or a non-ceremonial marriage. You must live together for a period of time, and these requirements may vary by state. So there's a list of what is in each state. You have to live together for a certain period of time. For many states, it may be about 7 years. But again, that you need to check each state's regulations. You need to present yourself as a part of a married couple. Declare the person you're living with as your wife or your husband or your spouse. And be legally able to marry. So in other words, you need to be of the legal age that would be considered if you were to marry. And then that would be considered a common law marriage. These are legal in 10 states and the District of Columbia. 7 states recognize common law marriage under specific conditions. They may have been formed before a certain date, before maybe laws changed. In both types of marriages, the partners must meet the minimum age requirement and must not engage in what we call bigamy. Bigamy is defined as marrying a second person while the first marriage is still legal. This happened quite often in our history. Many people may have left a spouse, traveled to another part of the country, and married again. That would be considered bigamy. Children's inheritance and child support issues are common when common law marriages break up, so you can have issues with child support, things like that. So issues are definitely something to consider. We're going to go over some definitions, some terminology that you'll become familiar with and we'll be using quite a bit this semester. Endogamy and exogamy, and these are two marriage rules. So it's another similarity in that all societies have rules, formal or informal, in choosing the right, again, air quotes, the right mate. Endogamy, or sometimes referred to as homogamy, requires marrying within one's group. For example, being of the same religion, the same race, the same ethnicity, the same social class or age. We call that marrying within those particular groups. Exogamy or heterogamy requires marriage outside one's group. And this would mean marrying, not marrying your relatives. You marry outside of your family group. In the U.S., 25 states prohibit marriage between first cousins. There are some societies that would allow you to marry, I think, the third cousin. Your third cousin would be, you're legally able to marry a third cousin. And there's and within your chapter, when you're reading the chapter, you'll see cousin marriage in Iraq is very common. The Middle East, Africa, Asia, Iraq, Pakistan, and Nigeria. Some religious groups are endogamous because they require couples to marry within their own faith. That's marrying within that group. Question 3. What is the incest taboo? It forbids people closely related by blood from having sexual activity. B. It allows people who are closely related by blood to have sexual activity. C. It encourages people to have multiple sexual partners. Or D. It shuns gay men from the society. And the correct answer is A. It forbids people closely related by blood from having sexual activity. Question 4, family is a part of a secondary group. Is that true or is that false? And that is false. Family is your primary group. Next, we're going to talk about how do families differ worldwide. We'll discuss that there are 5 ways that families differ. The first is family structure. The family we are born into, we call our biological family, or that family of origin. We're born into this family, we're adopted or raised in as our own, or our family of orientation. So you'll hear me refer sometimes to as the family of origin, the family of orientation. That's the family into which we are born or adopted. The family of procreation is what we form when we marry or have or adopt children of our own. When we go off and we create our own family with our partners or spouses and have children or adopt children. Each type is part of what we call a kinship system. And this is a network of people we are related to by marriage, blood, or adoption. Our nation's family structure was stable for nearly a century, and that is between 1880 and 1970. 85% of all children lived in 2-parent households. Then in 1980, 1990, and through 2012, 2016, that range of dates, the number of single parents jumped to where nearly 1 in 4 children lived in a single mother household. And that's where kinships networks really become a very integral part of helping the family. And so here are the statistics of where we're seeing, from selected years from 1880 all the way through 2016. And you can see let's call that the yellow bar, where two parents, that number is starting to shrink, where children are living in two-parent families. We're seeing the mother-only families, that little light green bar, really start to grow the percentages over time, particularly between 1970 through now 2016. Father-only families have been pretty stable, and the percent is relatively small compared to single mothers. But if we do want to acknowledge that there are single fathers out there as well. Next are nuclear and extended families. And nuclear families, very common in Western society, and they're made up of parents and their biological or adopted children. We're seeing the numbers of nuclear families, and it's not nuclear in that it's explosive. It's nuclear as in the nucleus, the core, the central core of a family, being that basics. And then extended family kind of grows off of that nucleus. So the nuclear family is declining in number, and the extended families are becoming much more common. And extended families are parents, children, and other kin, aunts, uncles, nieces, nephews, cousins, and grandparents. What differs is that in much of the world, the most common family form are extended families. So as the number of single-parent households continues to increase in industrial countries, extended families are becoming more common. It makes it easier for a single parent to be able to go to work outside the home, help with childcare and household responsibilities. Many Americans believe that nuclear families are the most common type, yet these are families that are actually declining. Next, we have residence patterns, and families differ also in where they live, residence in which they live. The most common residence pattern around the world is patrilocal. That is when the married couple lives with the husband's family. In the U.S., married couples are typically neolocal, where the couple actually sets up their own household. And oftentimes that most common in the U.S. and in other industrialized countries. So even though neolocal, they may live closer to one side of the family or the other, but in many cases, may live distant from both extended families. Matrilocal is when the couple lives with the wife's family. Since the 1990s, we've seen an increase in the number of newly married couples who live with either the wife or the husband's parents, even the grandparents. At least half because they can't afford a house. Others have low-income jobs. Some are supporting children after a divorce. And still others prefer to live in a multi-generational household. Families also differ in their authority patterns. And next we're going to talk about authority and power. Who has the power? And residence patterns typically indicate who has the authority in the family. In a matriarchal family system, the oldest females control the cultural, political, and economic resources, usually the grandmothers and mothers. These are rare, but we have examples even here in the United States. Native American tribes and some even African cultures still we still find very matriarchal family systems. A more typical pattern worldwide is the patriarchal family, where the oldest males have the cultural, political, and economic power over females, typically the grandfathers, fathers, even uncles. Women have few rights in these types of societies and may not be permitted to work outside the home or attend school or college. And in some societies, they have a great deal of decision-making power in the home rather than outside of the home, but they can't divorce or run for office. In the U.S., we'd like to think that our family systems are egalitarian, where both partners share power and authority equally. However, we tend to be patriarchal. Employed women still do 2 times as much housework and childcare as do men. We call this a second shift. So not only are they working outside the home, they're still doing a majority of the work inside the home as well. And they're more likely to care for elderly family members. We call that the sandwich generation, which we'll get into a little bit later. Nearly 1,000 cultures around the world differ in that they allow some form of polygamy, where this is when a man or a woman has 2 or more spouses. Monogamy is where one person is married exclusively to another person. In the U.S., with our high divorce and remarriage rates, it is more likely serial monogamy, where people marry several people, but only one at a time. This is where you marry, with the incidence of marrying, divorce, and remarrying, redivorce. So there's, we often talk about a serial monogamy. Now, polygamy has 2 forms. Polygyny and polyandry. Polygyny is where one man is married to 2 or more women. Polyandry is where one woman is married to 2 or more husbands. And this is rare, polyandry. However, there's an area in Tanzania and Africa where they practice this. There's maybe a shortage of women. It's allowed in nearly 1,000 cultures. Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So we do see instances here in the U.S. as well. Another culture is the Nimba culture of Nepal and Tibet in the remote Himalayan mountains. Typically 3 brothers and 1 wife, and because of, it's typically because of land issues. This helps minimize the number of children. Too, the eldest brother chooses the wife, and she must place the husband's shoes outside of the bedroom so that he knows who he's spending the night with. Polygyny is common in some other regions of Africa, South America, and the Middle East. The Quran states that a Muslim is permitted up to 4 wives at a time. So for many, there's economic reasons for this to happen, and demographic reasons, and also religious reasons. Polygamy is forbidden in Western and other industrialized society, but it is found in the U.S. and Canada and Europe. As I mentioned, the Mormons of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints banned polygamy in 1890, yet about 300,000 families in Texas, Arizona, Utah, and Canada are headed by the Fundamentalist Church, the FLDS, a polygamous sect. In fact, in the news, current event was, I guess this is 2011, Warren Jeffs was convicted. He wasn't, necessarily convicted for having so many spouses, but because of the age of the young women, they were 2 girls were documented to be 15 and 12, but there were quite a few. He had 78 wives total. 24 were found to be under the age of 17, but because of those 2 girls, he was able to be convicted, and I believe he's still in jail today. Now, before I ask this question, some Americans are concerned that the nuclear family is becoming less common. Viewing the nuclear family as the only normal or natural type rules out many household forms. So let's talk about, answer these questions, and we'll get into more about some of these myths about the family. If a person is adopted or raised in a family, then it is her family of A, origin, B, orientation, C, procreation, or D, cohabitation. And the answer is orientation. But it's also, again, the family of origin. So I would probably accept both of those answers. In patriarchal family system, oldest females control cultural, political, and economic resources. Is that true or false? Oldest females. That is false. It's the oldest males in the patriarchal patri meaning male, and matri would be female. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the myths. We said about the, is the family declining? The nuclear family is an indication that the family is declining. So we're going to talk about some myths about the family. Families are very diverse, and we have this idealized image of what a good family looks like. We're going to distinguish between functional versus dysfunctional myths. These 5 common myths about the family are myths about the past, myths about what is natural, myths about the self-sufficient family, myths about the family as a loving refuge, and myths about the perfect marriage, the perfect family. Then we'll go over why myths are dysfunctional and why they can be functional. First, the myths about the past. When we think about the past, we often think about it in terms of the good old days. We hear a lot of older people reminiscing about the good old days. And there were fewer problems, people were happier and families were stronger. That's this conception. Movies and television influence that idea, or our ideas about a romantic notion of a family life in earlier times. Historians say the golden days never really existed. We romanticize them because we know so little about the past. In fact, even in the 1800s, there were out-of-wedlock births, there was domestic violence, and desertion by a parent or a spouse. Accidents also are very common. Illness and disease affected many families. Men and women had a much shorter life expectancy, leaving many children with extended families in foster care or even orphanages. People were less likely to grow up in a nuclear family than they are now. Some facts about the past. The teenage pregnancy rates were very high in the 1950s compared to today, but also there was a higher proportion of teens getting married. Until the 1970s, people kept quiet about things like child abuse, domestic violence, unhappy marriages, divorce. Parents spent more time, they spend more time, I should say, than today with their children than they did in the past. So we have this, idea that the good old days, in the so-called good old days, many families lived in dugouts made from sod cut out from the prairie. And so if you see these living conditions, they're very harsh and often very dangerous. In living out in the Midwest, you had, wildlife at night. There was no of the modern conveniences that we have today. Air conditioning, running water, things of that nature. Next, myths about what is natural. Many people have strong opinions about what is natural or unnatural in families. Remaining single, child-free, unmarried, committed relationships. We assume it is natural to want to get married and have children, especially for women. There's this notion, from, again, the romanticized past. But many people would prefer to remain single or remain child-free. And so we need to really rethink what is considered natural. Next, we have the myth about the self-sufficient family. Few families, either past or present, are entirely self-sufficient. As individuals, we cherish achievement, self-reliance, and self-sufficiency. But at some point or another, most of us need some assistance. So if we lose our jobs, for example, again, there's been an increase in unemployment and the recession and poverty since, the 1970s. Anytime there's an economic downturn, think about today when we're living through the pandemic and what's going on in society today. Many people need assistance to sustain themselves and their families. For the working poor, many are two-parent families needing assistance to survive. Middle class, for example, too, did well in the 50s and 60s with the help of federal housing loans, increased access to higher education, public roads linking homes in the suburbs to jobs in the city. So again, they're not self-sufficient. People who are at retirement age currently, whether rich or poor, receive Medicare and Social Security. The government provides numerous tax cuts for middle income and even affluent families. The government spends billions each year on, regardless of a person's social class, on K through 12 public education, public broadcasting, local beaches and recreation centers, farm subsidies, clean drinking water, and highways. So again, we still need to, we're not entirely self-sufficient, even though we value self-achievement. Then there's the myth of the family as a loving refuge. There's a commonly held belief that families provide love, nurturance, and emotional support. Yet it can also be a source of both physical and psychological abuse. Research indicates that a large number of kids suffer from physical and sexual abuse by family members, and intimate partner violence is widespread. These are things we are going to talk about in the last chapter at the end of this semester. Oftentimes parents experience the stress of trying to balance family and work responsibilities. Unemployment rates went from 4% in 2006 to 12% in 2012, and even again today with the pandemic, many people are out of work as a result of businesses closing down, and oftentimes we take our stresses out on those we are closest to. Tensions over the ability to provide for family has a negative impact on the loving refuge. Expectations over pleasant and cheerful family interactions can lead to disappointment when routine problems often arise. Then we have the myth about the perfect marriage and family. Numerous marriages end in divorce as a result of unrealistic expectations. Historian John Gillis describes two families, the one we live with, the way families really are, and the one we live by, the way we would like families to be. After that wedding, we expect our partners to be good providers, excellent partners, especially sexual partners, and committed partners, our best friend, companions, our soulmate. But these myths can spark dissatisfaction and conflict because we're so busy searching for that fairy tale that we tend not to enjoy the families that we have. And here we have an example of a family ritual, like a Thanksgiving dinner or holidays, anything that brings people together and reinforces those kinship ties. And so for many families that are experience conflict and dysfunction, seeing images of that perfect family can often be something in our expectation that many families are unable to live up to that. But it is a nice image. And this is why myths can be dysfunctional. When we have a negative, often an unintended consequence that disrupts a family. People feel miserable if they can't live up to that expectation, that perfect family Thanksgiving dinner, this holiday, picture image. We can't, it's a high expectation to try to achieve. So instead of accepting our families for who they are, people try to change themselves for acceptance. Their children, they try to change their children for who they want them to become. And because we don't fit the mythical mold, then we start to blame ourselves, so when people blame themselves for the gap that they perceive between that image and reality, we fail to see the larger external forces that are at play, like social policies and other social problems that resulted in the family crisis, or on the individual level. When we get into more deeper, the false consciousness versus the class consciousness. There are circumstances that are often beyond our control that put us in different predicaments. Now we'll talk about how these myths can be functional. Some myths can actually function to bring people together, to promote, what we call social solidarity. If a myth can give us hope that marriage and family can improve, then we are more likely to stick around and work through any problems that arise. You just have to weather the storm. This idea that this myth can help us maintain emotional balance during a crisis. Some myths can also free us from that guilt and shame. For example, if a marriage doesn't work out, simply, you fell out of love, versus I made a mistake. Just think about it in terms of, well, things changed. So we often weather many storms throughout life. The belief in the decline of the family is oftentimes considered functional because it has generated some social policies that have helped provide support, child support legislation, social security supports for families that are in need. So again, we see this functional concept that can develop out of some of the myths, trying to keep children out of poverty. But the same myth can also act as a dysfunction, the decline of the family, that image if we become preoccupied with finding that self-fulfillment and happiness. So we need to be careful to not fall into that deep image. So which one of the following is a myth about the family? A, in the old days, families worked hard and often were subject to accidents, illnesses, and disease. B, egalitarian family systems non-existent. C, families always provide love, nurturance, and support, emotional support. And D, imperfect marriages are pervasive. It is that C, families always provide love, nurturance, and emotional support. They don't, there are examples of families that don't always provide that. The notion of complete self-sufficiency is mythical. True or false? That is true. We are not completely self-sufficient as we described. There are three perspectives on the changing family, so we're going to cover these next. Many Americans believe that the family is falling apart. This is according to many journalists and scholars. It's vanishing, it's in trouble, and divorce is usually that example, that sign. Yet we still place this high value on marriage and family. If you asked high school seniors, 80% of girls and 72% of boys say that having a good marriage and family life is extremely important to them. Almost 74% of first-year college students, both men and women, say that raising a family is very important. And almost 70% of Americans are optimistic about the future of marriage and family. So we do have this high value that's placed on getting married someday. So let's talk about the first perspective. And the first perspective is that the family is declining. According to social scientist E.R. Groves, in the late 1920s, it's back in the 1920s, marriages were in a state of collapse. What he called a marriage crisis back then is very similar to today's view. He said people were self-indulgent, they were only concerned with themselves and not others. Financial strain, and they had incompatible personalities. We're talking the late 20s, the roaring 20s, there's a lot of social change. So you got to think about the time periods that this research is being conducted in. Many who align with this perspective cite reasons like individual irresponsibility, minimal commitment to the family, and selfishness. Conservative politicians and academics argue that the family is declining because people are putting their own needs above family duties. Claiming that we live in a very individualistic society, and we tend to live in a very individualistic society and culture today. So these politicians and academics claim that many adults are unwilling to invest their psychological and financial resources in their children, or they give up on their marriages too quickly when they encounter problems. They believe that marriage should just, exist for the sake of the children, not just, the adults. To prove their point, they say some indicators that adherence to this perspective cite that there are fewer adults are married, more are divorced or remaining single, more living together outside of marriage or alone, more children are born out of wedlock, the increase in number of single-parent households, married women having fewer children, and compared to 1960, partners who spend less time with their children. So they're using those the data to support their claim. The second perspective is that family is changing. It's not declining. According to this perspective, the argument is that the changes people experience are part of longer term trends. For example, although more women have entered the labor force since 1970, women have always worked. They worked in dairy, dairy products. They sold dairy products. They stitched clothing in colonial times. They took in boarders. Analysts argue that family problems have always existed. Studies of the 1930s include divorce, desertion, and family crisis. Also, there have always been single-parent families. The percent of single-parent households has doubled since 1980, but the percent tripled from 1990 to 1950. Divorce was also common in the 18th century. Parents also had less control over adult children. There was little land to inherit, little land or property to inherit, and there was an increase in the importance of romantic love. We'll talk about that in much more detail later. Researchers say that there is little empirical evidence that family change is synonymous with family decline. The data support both perspectives. The family is in trouble as well as most families are resilient despite changes, gender roles, divorce rates, and alternatives to marriage, such as living together. Here again, another support that family is just changing. It's not declining. We have the legalization of same-sex marriage that recognizes committed relationships, provides gay couples and their children social and economic benefits, and promotes family stability. The third perspective on the family is that the family is more resilient than ever. According to this perspective, families are more resilient, loving, and stronger than in the past. Changes in family life have strengthened family relationships, including marriages. Now remember, families of the past, there were only a small number of white middle-class families that lived up to that sentimental notion or idea. Especially in the colonial days when women and children were often severely punished by strict male authority figures. In the past, many stayed in unhappy marriages. There were strong social norms against, getting divorced. There were legal divorce obstacles put into place. Today, that's no longer there is no longer a stigma attached to divorce. Adults can establish new relationships and raise children in happier homes. Also, the happiest families are those in which adults share domestic and work responsibilities, especially among working mothers. The sharing of the housework and childcare increases marital satisfaction for both males and females. Some argue that despite all of the problems, families are happier today than in the past, especially because of multi-generational relationships. More people have grandparents. They feel very close to them. They often receive emotional, economic support from them. So again, that helps, with the resilience of the family. What opposing view of the family is popular today? The family is deteriorating, the family is changing, the family is getting stronger, or D, all of the above? And the answer is D, all of the above. Family problems have always existed, and issues such as divorce, desertion, and family crisis resulting from discord, delinquency, and depression existed in the early 1900s. Is that true or false? That is true. These problems have always existed. So how are U.S. families changing? We will now look at demographic changes. Also, we're going to get into some racial and ethnic diversity and some economic transformations. So first, the demographic changes. There are two changes that have had far-reaching effects on families. The U.S. birth rates, which have declined. People are having fewer children. These children are born closer together, and families finish having kids early. Also, the average age of the population rose. In the mid-1800s, the average age of the population was 17 years old. In 2010, the last decennial census, the average age was 37. Both of these shifts result in Americans experiencing empty nest syndrome at an earlier age, earlier grandparenthood, prolonged widowhood. As more Americans live longer, many adults must care for both children and elderly parents. We're experiencing that sandwich generation. And some other changes, probably since about 1970, 60, up through 2015-16, seeing more non-marital births, more people living alone, more working mothers, and more older people. So first, the change in family and non-family households. The U.S. Census definition of a family household are two or more people living together who were related through marriage, birth, or adoption. And the key here is, within a household. That's what the census uses as the designation. How many people live in a household and how are they related. A non-family household are people who live alone or with non-relatives. This would be roommates, boarders, or cohabitating couples. In 2010, 34% of all households were non-family households. This increased from 19% in 1970. The number of married couple households with children decreased. It was less than 18 declined from with children less than 18 years old. So let me rephrase that. The number of married couple households with children under the age of 18 declined from 40% in 1970 to 20% in 2010. The percent of children under 18 living in single-parent households more than doubled at the same time. The main reason is due to an increase in births to unmarried women. Next, we have single and cohabitating couples. Singles make up one of the fastest growing groups. And three reasons. Young adults are postponing marriage. Because so many are living longer, also they're more likely to outlive a partner. And the last reason is older women. They've either divorced or widowed and are less likely to remarry. So we're seeing an increase in the number of singles in the later years. Singles also are more likely to live alone because they have the income to do so. The percent of cohabitating couples has climbed since 1970. We expect this number to grow with the increasing acceptance of it. Next, we have divorce and remarriage, and divorces have decreased since the late 1980s, but almost 1 out of 2 first marriages are expected to end in divorce. Many teen marriages and women who married because they became pregnant are likely to divorce. Then we have step families. These are more common than in the past. 12% of Americans are in their second, third, or even fourth marriage. 1 out of 3 Americans is a step parent, a step child, or a step sibling. Then we have, the single parent families or one parent families. Adults are remaining single into their 30s, and because divorce rates are high, the number of children living with one parent has increased. 87% of all single parent households are mother-child families. Employed mothers Another demographic, the higher labor force participation of mothers since 1980 is one of the most drastic changes in American families. The percent of two-earner married couples with children under the age of 18 increased from 31% in 1976 to 54% in 2010. So this has increased dramatically, that more than 6 out of every 10 married women with children under the age of 6 is in the labor force. It's very significant. Couples must cope with home care, employment responsibilities, all while raising children. So again, trying to maintain that work-family balance is very challenging. And lastly, we have older people. Americans are simply living longer. Life expectancy is 79.68 years. We're ranked 42 in the world. So who do you think lives longer, men or women? Well, women do. The female life expectancy is 81.1 years, while the male life expectancy is 76.4 years. Sorry, I almost shaved 10 years off the guys' lives. So a male's life expectancy is 76.4, females is 81.1. The 4% increase of people 65 and older since 1970 is small, but this population grew from 19 million in 1970 to nearly 41 million in 2011. So although children are enjoying having grandparents around, there's a strain on family caregivers and healthcare costs. And here we have the table. It really illustrates many of the points we just made. So you want to take a look at this table, 1970, around 1960, and some of the cases where, and compared to 2016, where we have more births to unmarried women. That percent really has increased. The more people that live alone, that percent has increased. More young adults who live with their parents, aged 18 to 34. More employed mothers of children under the age of 6. We see how that dramatically increased. And then more people that are age 65 and older, the aging, the graying of America, we call that. Next, I'd like to talk about some racial ethnic diversity. The U.S. is the most multicultural country in the world. We have an ethnic diversity where we see it's booming. Nearly 40 million people account for almost 13% of the total U.S. population that is foreign-born, up from 8% in 1990. There are 150 distinct ethnic or racial groups. By 2025, only 58% is projected to be white, down from 86% in 1950. By 2050, it is projected that whites only make up half of the total population because Latino and Asian populations are expected to triple. U.S. residents speak approximately 336 languages. About 85% of the foreign-born speak a language other than English at home, compared with 10% of the native population. The multiracial population is also increasing. The number of Americans who identify with 2 or more races is expected to triple from almost 6 million in 2010 to more than 16 million in 2050. And here this figure illustrates the racial and ethnic composition of the U.S. population from 1950, as a result of the 2010 decennial census, and then projected in 2025. So we see the data where in 1950 there was 86% white, 10% African American, 3% Latino, and only 1% Asian American. And you could see those numbers starting to really change in 2010 and what is expected in 2025. So where do racial ethnic families live? They live in all parts of the country, but tend to settle in certain regions. We call this clustering. Usually it's a reflection of employment opportunities and established immigrant communities that really help new immigrants find housing and jobs. In the past, There were also federal government policies in place, and these policies encouraged certain communities to accept refugees from Southeast Asia. It forced Native Americans or American Indians to live on reservations, and it implemented laws that limited certain Asian groups to specific areas. So if you look at this map and look at the different shades, Latinos are most prevalent in the Southwest and California. Asians are most common in Texas along the West Coast and major metropolitan areas. Blacks are concentrated in the South, stretching from Texas to Maryland, and whites dominate the Midwest and parts of the West and the Northeast. A non-family household constitutes A, people related through marriage, birth, or adoption, B, married couple households with children under age 18, C, children living in one-parent families, or D, people who live alone or with non-relatives. The answer is D, people who live alone or with non-relatives. U.S. birth rates have declined in recent years. Is that true or false? That's correct. The answer is true. Next, the question is, why are U.S. families changing? Family change is reflected in choice. For example, deciding to marry later or even to have children, and constraints. Constraints that limit these choices. For example, unemployment or family policies. So to understand choice, we have what we call micro-level influences. So a micro-level perspective really focuses on people's social interaction patterns, their social interaction patterns in a specific setting. That would be a micro-level influence. So to understand constraint, the macro-level perspective, which focuses on large-scale patterns and processes that characterize society as a whole. Both are very influential. Micro-level influences help us to understand people's personal choices. So when we think of choice, we think of the micro level. When we think of constraints, we look at the macro level. So these micro level influences are limited because they can't explain some of the things that we have little control over. For example, the choice to postpone marriage, get an education, get a good job, make a good living first, because of economics or the economy we live in, to make try to make those choices. The macro level influences, those large scale phenomena, the economy, technology, popular culture, social movements, and family policies all limit our choices and require more macro level explanations. So for example, the economy. The Industrial Revolution and urbanization resulted in changes that had major impacts on the family. In the late 18th century, factories replaced local industry that employed women and children. Families became less self-sufficient, resulting in increasingly working outside of the home. Parents' control over the children became less. In the 1980s and 1990s, many U.S. corporations began to move operations out of the country to more developing nations. These moves resulted in the layoffs of millions of American workers. As the U.S. economy changed, low-paying service jobs replaced high-pay manufacturing jobs, where we changed from a manufacturing to a more service industry. Also, higher-paying jobs require at least a college degree, resulting in many postponing marriage and parenthood. The financial crisis of 2007 resulted in high unemployment rates, reduced work hours, loss of health benefits, and financial distress. These all disrupted the family life in the U.S. and around the world. Technology, one thing we've witnessed is a decline in infant deaths and people living longer. as a result of advances in medical and health-related technology. Older Americans who live into their 80s risk poverty. They often require expensive medical service or simply outlive their retirement savings. The sandwich generation must cope, and these are typically the family members, the female family members that must, fall between caring for elderly family, relatives and caring for their own children. We witnessed internet and online interaction that influences families. Social media, email, texting, and social networking intended to promote social interaction, it can actually replace those close personal relationships. Digital technology often cuts into family time. Parents are often preoccupied with their devices. There's many studies that show that. Look how much time we're spending on technology with the social distancing we are experiencing with the current pandemic. 64% of adults say the 21st century communication technology has brought families together. They're being able to stay in touch with adult children who move out, living distances from families, especially with military families who are deployed overseas. And again, another example, the pandemic, where we're social distancing. Many people are learning how to, FaceTime and, communicate through Zoom. So the email, internet, Skype, these all have encouraged those long distance, social distance connections to family members. We can share photos, track down some old friends, trace family history, and get online health information. Telehealth has become a big deal again recently, in recent months. People in their 80s and 90s are also learning and using these types of technology to stay connected and to stay active. Popular culture refers to the beliefs, practices, activities, and products that are widely shared among a population in everyday life. Television, the internet, pop music, magazines, radio, advertising, sports, hobbies, fads, fashions, and movies. And we need to find out what's on fleek. TV often transmits both fact and fiction. According to statistics, the average American in a 65-year lifetime will spend 9 years in front of a TV set. We cannot believe everything, though, we see on TV or online. But pop culture does definitely shape our attitudes and beliefs. We also have social movements, civil rights movement, women's rights movement, gay rights and marriage movement. They've all resulted in social change. Now, civil rights in the 1960s had impact on U.S. families because of affirmative action. Minority group members were able to obtain education, economic opportunities that ultimately improved the socioeconomic status. Minority applicants could receive small business loans and be considered for promotions to higher level positions. Women's rights in the late 1800s and especially in the 1970s impacted women's roles. As women gained more rights in law, education, and employment, they became less dependent on men and questioned their traditional gender roles, thus improving their circumstances. The gay rights movement began in the 1970s. It challenged discrimination in areas such as housing, adoption, and employment. As a result, many companies provide benefits to their employees, gay or lesbian partners. A number of adoption agencies assist gays and lesbians who want to become parents. More and more states began to recognize civil unions, and all now have legalized same-sex marriage. The marriage movement is trying to repeal no-fault divorce and wants to reduce federal and state benefits for children born to unmarried low-income mothers because of alarm over high divorce rates and an increase in cohabitation. Then we have family policies, and this refers to the measure that governments take to improve the well-being of families. Some of these policies address family formation and processes, things like adoption, marriage, divorce, domestic violence, and welfare reform. Others impact family life, for example, healthcare, housing, poverty, and substance abuse. parents and families have influenced major social policy changes, such as the education of children with disabilities, child pornography, joint custody of children after divorce, the right of older children to die, the right of older people to die with dignity and better nursing care facilities. Here's one example of a social movement. On January 21st, 2017, participants in the Women's March wore pink hats that visualize a unifying symbol that defied Donald Trump's vulgar statements about women during the presidential campaign. And we can extend this even further and talk about the Black Lives Matter movement that has been going on in the last recent months, and examine that as a social movement to, again, encourage social change. Positive social change. Micro-level perspective focuses on A, people's social interaction, B, large-scale patterns and processes that characterize society, C, constraints that limit individual choices, and D, economic factors that impact individual choices. And the answer is A, people's social interaction. That micro level is the perspective that focuses on the choice, people's social interaction. Macro level is the larger scale constraints that society places on our choices. The term popular culture refers to various social movements that have changed the family life over the years. Is this true or false? That's right. The answer is false. Now we're going to talk about some multicultural or cross-cultural and global perspective on the family. As sociologists, we want to think of things, the globalization of society. Your text includes material on subcultures within the U.S. and cultures in other countries because unless we are 100% American or Native American Indian, our ancestors were either immigrants or slaves. These cultural beliefs and practices shape current families. Two changes facing families are not only national but also global. The effect of the world as an international place. We see the effect of the internet that's helping to impact families. Number 3, U.S. businesses recognize the importance of understanding other societies and different cultures. Since the late 1980s, companies have begun requiring employees take courses in other on other cultures, and they want employees who speak other languages besides English. Understanding customs of other countries challenges our notion that U.S. families are the norm. And finally, families are changing around the world. Cross-cultural knowledge and information may result in understanding instead of conflict. A traditional white middle-class model isn't adequate for understanding marriages and families because A, its members have high divorce rates, B, its members passively accept policy changes, C, population today is a mosaic of cultural, religious, ethnic, racial, and socioeconomic groups, or D, myths about perfect marriages and families are more pervasive in white households. The answer is C. Population today is a mosaic of cultural, religious, ethnic, racial, and socioeconomic groups. Cross-cultural emphasis is not required for studying the changes facing families. Is that true or false? And the answer is false. We need to be able to consider cross-cultural emphasis in studying the family.